Today we're going to talk about what gives you power to determine worth and value. We're also going to talk about how to stop power leaks and hold on to your own personal power. Lastly, we're going to talk about the mistake that new and old climbers always make. Hey everyone, and welcome to the Chapter 1 summary, Becoming Conscious. And to say, it can be summed up in one word: observe. Arno talks about that this is a process to improve awareness, that this is the first step to becoming a better climber, and perhaps even a better martial artist, or maybe even a better partner. To recognize that our self-image is not a description of yourself or your immediate capabilities. This is where Arno starts to speak to this idea that exists in Zen of the phenomenal and the essential nature of human beings. So what is the phenomenal world? Well, it's everything you see. It's everything you believe you are. The essential world, I can't even tell you. I don't think there are words to actually describe it, but you can certainly feel it when you experience it. And Arno talks about our experiences in the phenomenal world here. Arno talks about being molded by society for good and bad achievements, being molded by your caregivers for good and bad behaviors. And all of this culminates into your ego. And he talks about Don Juan saying that the ego is a 1,000-headed dragon. And to me, that sounds like whack-a-mole. You never know when it's going to pop up, but you need to become conscious to observe when it does so that you can shut it down and get closer to your essential nature. So he goes on to lay out achievement as an idea about what does it mean to us? What does it mean to you? What does it mean when you can climb a 5'9", 5'8", 5'6" when you're a 5'12" climber? What does achievement mean in the dojo when you learn your new technique? What does achievement mean with your partner? Happiness, fulfillment, nice vacations? And he goes on to say that achievements, whether it's how much money you make, how hard you can climb, how often you can climb, how many people you've tapped out, whatever it is, all your external achievements that exist in this phenomenal world do not make us valuable. So where does our self-worth come from? This idea reminds me of a koan that I read in the Gateless Gate. For those interested, it's case 38, a cow passing through the window. For example, it's just like a great cow passing through a lattice window. Her head, horns, and 4 legs have passed through. Why is it that her tail cannot? I think that's such a wonderful example of talking about the phenomenal world versus the essential world. So guys, chew on that for a second. If the entire cow can pass through the lattice window, why can the tail not? I'll be honest, I struggled with this one for a long time. And I went on to read that essentially this Zen master was talking about the part of the cow that is phenomenal and letting it go. Her horns maybe represent your idea is that a brown belt should never tap out to a blue belt. Or maybe that a black belt should always know more about this throw than a white belt. Or maybe it's this idea that you have to outclimb everyone you're with. Or you're a 5'14" climber. Whatever it is, it's gone and it can pass through. But the tail is still there. Why? Because in the spirit of Zen and the spirit of duality, we cannot exist without existing. And as hard as we try to stamp out as many of those 1,000 heads as we can, it will forever be present. So as you stamp out those 1,000 heads, and as your achievements rack up in the climbing world, maybe the Jujitsu world, you have to ask yourself, do they really define your self-worth and your value as an individual? Do you value the person who climbs 5'6" less than the person who climbs 5'12"? Do you value the person who can tap everybody out in the dojo but has no respect for anybody more than the purple belt working with white belts? How do you let those things pass through the window, so to speak, to capture more of your essential nature? I want to ask you guys, what achievements in your life have made you feel valuable? Let me know in the comments below, and we're going to talk about what that essential nature is a little later in this video. Part of this phenomenal world are all the habits, thought patterns that you've established over the course of your lifetime. The habitual mind, he says, feels comfortable, but it is often a very shallow well. There isn't much to draw from. These habits, these thoughts, they stay hidden because they're so habitualized. It's like driving a car and all of a sudden you show up to your destination and you don't remember the trip because driving has become so habitualized for you. And that's part of awakening. That's part of becoming conscious, is that after you get down from that route and maybe you struggled at every single clip you could make and every single piece of pro you placed, what do you tell yourself habitually? So he comes on to say, well, how do you leave essentially this phenomenal world to start to dance in the essential nature of who you are? Witness, observation. Those themes are going to keep coming up. So he goes on to talk about the witness here. He also offers a very easy example of how to witness. He says, go out, watch somebody climb. Just watch them move. That's it. That's witnessing. Can you do that with yourself? Physically, spiritually, emotionally? Arno says that objectification and separation allows you to analyze and change habitual or unconscious ways of being. And he is so accurate. There is a wonderful philosopher by the name of Ken Wilber whose theory is fantastic and way beyond the scope of anything we're doing here. But I want to touch on one concept he speaks of, which is subject to object transformation. You will always be part of a subject, and you will always be analyzing an object. As those places switch, you have the opportunity to view yourself in a different light. Your current subject often is the unconscious and habitual pattern that you can't recognize because you're such a part of it. You're such a part of the experience that you can't witness it yet. You are too much a part of it to say, oh, I see myself doing that thing. Because if you could, it would be an object. And as you move up the level of the line or skill that you are developing, every new subject will eventually become an object. And that object will become part of your personal history. And as that transformation happens continuously throughout life, from subject to object, from subject to object, guess what's happening? The thing Arno wants us to know: growth. Because when I can witness myself, when I can witness the behaviors that cause challenge in my jujitsu, in my relationship, in climbing, I can wield my power over them to change them. So this subject-object idea runs so deep, and you can take it as far as you want. So as you're chewing on this subject-object stuff, we can start talking about values and self-worth. And Arno challenges us to question where those come from for us. Where does your self-worth come from? Where are your values derived from? And I thought it was interesting because Arno doesn't necessarily expand on this concept of how to go through this process other than more observation. I thought it would be good to give you a few ideas so you can embark on your own journey towards evaluating your own self-worth and discovering your values. One really fun way to discover your self-worth is through art therapy. There are a number of videos online that will help you do this, but the most simple one is to meditate on yourself, thinking of your self-worth, and just start drawing. Doesn't need to make sense, doesn't need to be good. You can draw stick figures, you could draw blobs, you could draw circles, squares, whatever it is that you're feeling with different colors. And when you're done, observe this thing. Because the idea is that it is unconscious and it is a representation of your unconscious. The other thing I wanted to mention was the value system. And I believe Tony Robbins has one of the easiest ones to understand. He says that in all his years of working with people, there are 6 values. And they are significance, certainty, uncertainty, connection and love, growth, and contribution. So as you're muddling through this phenomenal world, trying to figure out, well, what's my self-worth look like? What do my value structure look like? Tony Robbins says that there is one of these that you will value more than the others. And to give an example, certainty would be saying, oh, I love every time I come in and I roll with the same guy. Certainty. Uncertainty, man, I only like climbing new routes. Significance. I want to make sure that these people are here to see it. Connection and love. Maybe you climb because you love the people you climb with. Growth. Perhaps you like challenging yourself, whether it's slow, conscious movement on easy routes or climbing the hardest route you can possibly do safely. And lastly, contribution. I think this one's really important. How do we contribute? When we go out climbing, do we take new people out? Do we let our friends use our trad rack? Do we check their pieces if they're learning trad? I was very fortunate to have a friend do that with me. In jiu-jitsu, are we always just coming in to smash the next person into the mat? Or do we take time out to help people grow and build the community in the school so that it's better? And in our relationships, how do we contribute to the greater us? I know this may seem a bit divergent from the concept of climbing, but it's not. Because as we journey through this phenomenal world, working towards that essential nature, our self-worth, our value structure matters. And how we talk to ourselves matters. And these ideas, these values, the self-worth concept are the roots in which our flowers will blossom or not. Arno goes on to say that climbing punishes us like naive children, because how do you feel when you can't complete a climb? How do you feel after you fall? How do you feel if a blue belt taps you out and you're a brown belt? I think Arno's point here is that climbing is a representation of many of the experiences that we had growing up from our caretakers and life in general. And how do we deal with the challenges that face us, and how do we deal with the setbacks that are inevitable? He provides a word of caution. He says if performance boosts your self-worth, that boost is based on fiction, because you are essentially tangling up performance and outcome, and you will always end up losing. It is important to learn how to untangle your performance from your outcome, because guess what? That will lead you closer to the essential nature. That will lead you to a deeper part of yourself. How do we get there? I want to briefly talk about Carol Dweck's book, Mindset, because this is when we start to cross into understanding what the essential nature may be about. Growth mindset or performance mindset. Now, Arno didn't have the luxury of having the last 20 years of research, but we do. And we know now that if you are fortunate enough to be extremely skilled at something and happen to find that thing, you can have a performance mindset and still do extraordinarily well, actually as well as people with a growth mindset. But that's a special case. That's not everybody. Most people taking up a new skill are not going to be a natural at it, and they need a different way to think. It reminds me of when I was in graduate school, a study that I read about Eastern children versus Western children, and they were given a set of math problems. And at the end of it, the Western children who couldn't complete the math problems said things like, "I'm not good at math." They attributed it to internal competencies or lack thereof. Whereas the Eastern children said, "Oh, I have to do more of these. I didn't understand this concept yet." The Eastern children demonstrated what is known now as a growth mindset, whereas the Western children demonstrated what is now called a performance mindset. Whereas when they failed, it was me, not my lack of work, not my lack of understanding. It was me. It was something inherently wrong, when really they just needed to do more problems. This concept kind of rocked the psychology world for a while. Your growth mindset can be applied to anything. And this is the mistake that new and old climbers alike make. And this is what Arno starts to talk about. When you can untangle your performance from the outcome, you start to enter growth mindset. If you go up to that 5'11" and believe, "I'm a 5'11" climber, I should be able to do this no problem," and you get up there and you struggle bust the whole way, you might come down and say, "That route's stupid. I'm not a good climber. Maybe I'm not as good as a climber as I thought." However many self-deprecating remarks you can think of. Whereas the growth climber might say, "Wow, that route was really challenging. I can't wait to do it again. There was this one part that I really struggled on. I really want to do that part again." That's growth mindset, because they're not concerned about how they performed. They're concerned about getting better and growing. This happens in Jujitsu all the time. It happens in relationships all the time. Guys, these concepts, as we have been saying, mimic the stuff of life. This is ancient knowledge. People haven't changed much. Which ties into the next concept that he talks about, is learning to love and loving to learn. Because when your self-worth is based on what you learned and not on your performance, you have the opportunity to forever be fulfilled, because it's not based on how well you did, whether you got to the top, whether you tapped somebody out, whether you got the art in this jujitsu correctly. Do you really think the rock cares that you climbed to the top of it? Arno gives us a question though, and he says, when you climb your best, or when you jujitsu'd your best, you feel different. What is that? If it's not tied to self-worth, if it's not based on performance, what is it? It's growth. That's what it is, and that's what he's trying to lead us here in this chapter. He's trying to tell us that when you leave the phenomenal world of self-doubt, of performance, of external rewards, you can enter into this place, the essential nature of who you are. Call it God, call it the higher self, call it whatever you wish, but it's about growth. And when you can tease out the aspects of yourself that are worried about what other people think, and you are only focused on yourself and how you are doing and how your body is moving, you will not only most likely perform better, but you will have endless fulfillment every time you step onto the mat, every time you touch the rock and start climbing, every single time you get to learn about your relationship with your partner. Arno likes to sum this whole thing up and talks about power sinks and power leaks. And I really like these concepts because he does a good job differentiating between power leaks, which are more about preserving your self-image, versus power sinks, which are more about your habitual mental game. And here's a few examples. So he talks about power leaks, and he says self-importance, your image of yourself, all of these things, your personal history, are all things that will contribute to you leaking power. And he goes on to even say boldly, your personal history doesn't matter. How does that make you feel? Because Arno says that if it bothers you, that statement, that's one of the heads of the 1,000-headed dragon of the ego. That your personal history is in fact a hindrance. And the more that you can disassociate from your personal history, the phenomenal world, perhaps you can start to pass through that lattice gate. Because we have to ask ourselves, how do we keep our personal power? How do we keep our power on the rock? How do we keep it while we're jujitsuing? How do we keep it? We're in the midst of an argument or just challenging discussion with somebody that we love and care about. Let's talk about power leaks. And he breaks this down into 4 categories. 1. Ineffective mental habits. 2. Inner dialogue. 3. Reacting rigidly to a difficult scenario. 4. Hoping, wishing, negative self-talk. So I want to talk a little bit about each one very briefly. Ineffective mental habits. And one of the ones he talks about, we've all been there, with the person who's holding on with one hand, and they get some chalk, and then they switch hands, they chalk up again, and then they're chalking again, and they're just up there constantly chalking. The inner dialogue. Do you have an effective climbing coach? Do you have an effective jujitsu coach, relationship coach? What is your inner voice telling you when you make it to the hard part of the climb? Is it saying, oh, I don't trust my pro? What if that bolt blows? Or when you're in jujitsu and somebody almost has an armbar or a choke, are you freaking out saying, oh my God, they're about to choke me? What are those mental habits? Or in a relationship when you're scared and vulnerable, what is your inner coach saying? Run, don't be vulnerable. That's about becoming conscious of what that inner coach is telling you. 3, reacting rigidly to difficult scenarios. I know of many friends who have gotten on 5'9s only to find out they're on a 5'10 because they wandered. It's typically on the serial wall. And I get it. Sometimes it happens. But Arno talks about how believing that a 5'9 shouldn't be hard is a way of you leaking power. Because regardless of what your conception of a 5'9 is, in that moment, you still have the wall to climb. And that draining, that thought, that wishing, which we'll get to next, only drains you of the vitality that you need to perform to get up the rock. Last one, 4, wishing, hoping, and negative self-talk. You ever hear that person say, oh, I wish this hold was better. Oh, I wish I had more energy. They're all power leaks. They're all you taking your focus off of your objective. Do you guys remember when we started this journey 4 weeks ago? We talked about impeccable attention. Do you see how it's used? Do you see how becoming conscious is an impeccable use of your attention? How you're not letting these thoughts, these inner coaches, these bad phrases, these negative self-talk turn into core beliefs about yourself. You're stopping them at the gate. You're not letting them pass through that lattice window. Because being a warrior, whether you're on the mat, whether you're on the rock, or wherever you're at in life, requires becoming conscious with impeccable attention. It's not easy. And Arno goes on to suggest a few ways that we can do it. I would like to suggest my way though first. And that's meditate, 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 and meditate. Because the practice of bringing yourself back to your breath is the practice of recognizing what is happening internally, emotionally, and inside your head. Because you're focusing on one thing and it gets pulled and you're like, oh my God, why am I thinking about bacon right now? And you come back to your breath. And all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, why am I thinking about the Rock Warrior's Way book? And you come back to your breath. And that coming back to is the pause or delay that Arno talks about. Is that you have a moment to change your entire life and your entire state by saying, I'm going to pause and just observe and become conscious of what I'm doing. I'm going to observe the phenomenal world of who I believe I am. And because I'm doing that, I now have a choice to do something different. And we talked about this last week. Are you going to choose to do something different that may be vulnerable, that may be getting on a harder route, that may be rolling with the new student that came in, that may be challenging yourself with a visiting student, or maybe it's perfecting the fundamentals of your jujitsu art and going back to the very beginning? Because when you disassociate, as Arno says, your habitual response, you can take new action. So Arno challenges us and asks, the next time you fall, what are your thoughts? What are your feelings? And I would go on to challenge you guys and say, the next time you're on the mat, the next time you feel humbled, what are the thoughts that go along with it? Are one of your 1,000 heads of that dragon showing up? And in your relationship, when you feel challenged, when you feel vulnerable, where you feel scared, or better yet, joyful, what are your thoughts? Can you pause and take a moment to become conscious and witness the person you are in that moment and have the opportunity to take new action? Guys, thank you for sticking with me. If you really like this video, feel free to hit the like button, and I'll see you next week.